Hey everybody, welcome to another Games That Depress Me to No End. This is Age of Empires 4. I was actually looking forward to Age of Empires 4, because Age of Empires 2 is my favorite real-time strategy game of all time. I certainly enjoyed Age of Empires 3 as well, and I enjoyed Age of Empires 1 back in the day, although that game has aged pretty poorly. Although if you are interested in giving Age of Empires 1 a try, the Definitive Edition is definitely the way to go with that, because it does have some accessibility features that are definitely appreciated. But anyway, as far as AoE 4 was concerned, I was actually really looking forward to that, because the last Age of Empires game we had before that wasn't just a remake or a remaster, was Age of Empires 3 back in 2005. So it's been quite a long time for the Age of Empires series. And then, of course, for the real-time strategy game genre in general, we really haven't had all that many of them come out that had any real traction. At least not of the traditional base-building variety that you see with stuff like Age of Empires, Command & Conquer, Warcraft, Starcraft, etc. A lot of the problem there is actually stuff I covered in my rant about Starcraft, and why I hate that game so much. But to give you a really short version, it's not because that game is bad, it's actually not a bad real-time strategy game. It's that because it got so popular, developers thought that they needed to copy-paste the StarCraft formula, and they needed to go for the esports crowd, when the esports crowd is such a tiny minority of the real-time strategy fan base that it actually alienates basically everybody if you go that route. And Age of Empires has always been a series that never went that route. It always did its own thing, and always appealed way more to the casual crowd than it did the esports crowd. That's not to say that Age of Empires 2 in particular doesn't have an esports scene, but that was never the focus, at least not until much more recently, and we'll get to that, don't worry. But suffice to say, Age of Empires has always been more of a safe haven for those of us like myself who don't play real-time strategy games for the competitive side of things. That's not to say we don't play against other players at all, it's just to say that we don't go into these kinds of games going for any kind of esports play. We don't really care about actions per minute or optimized build strategies or whatever. And thus we go into these kinds of games just wanting to try different things, see what works, what doesn't work, play against the AI and maybe do a comp stomp with friends, or if we are playing against other players, we're not doing it in some sort of try-hard manner, trying to just absolutely demolish the other players. We're just going into it to have some casual fun. As such, that means that all of the main attributes we're looking for in a real-time strategy game, and which pretty much everybody associates with Age of Empires at this point, are things like the pretty extensive campaign modes, or the very robust skirmish modes, where you have tons of options for maps, for gameplay settings, for all kinds of different game modes, things like that, and of course that all extends into the multiplayer as well. And that's not to mention things like the excellent soundtracks for the first two games, the sense of personality they have, things like the audio taunts, the various weird and wacky cheat codes that allow you to do things like spawn guys with laser guns, or spawn cars that have machine guns mounted on them, or in, for example, Age of Empires 3, where you can spawn a giant bust of George Washington that is named George Crushington, and just goes around whacking things with its face. Just things like that are just this extra bit of spice, this extra bit of personality that really makes it obvious the developers had a lot of fun making the game, and they want you to have fun playing it. And I distinctly remember an image that I think was from a magazine that covered the entire Age of Empires series up to that point, which was up to Age of Empires 3, and it also showed what could be potentially Age of Empires 4 and 5. With 4 being modern era, so we're talking World War I, World War II, that sort of thing, and the 5th game being set in space or some sort of sci-fi game. And that seemed like it would be a really cool idea. Unfortunately, Ensemble Studios got closed down by Microsoft after releasing Halo Wars, and the Age of Empires series went dormant, so the last new release we had had for quite a long time was Age of Empires 3: The Asian Dynasties, the second expansion for that game. And eventually, Microsoft did finally bring back Age of Empires 2 in the form of Age of Empires 2 HD, which had some assistance from the modding community that had worked on the Forgotten Empires mod, And that brought with it things like widescreen support, online multiplayer through Steam as opposed to the completely defunct MSN Gaming Zone from the old school games, or the Ensemble Online from Age of Empires 3, which is also defunct now. Or at least you can't make new accounts for it, so I don't know if it's actually still up and running or not. It probably isn't, given Age of Empires 3 Definitive Edition exists, but the last I heard was that you just couldn't create new accounts, and I haven't really heard anything since then, and haven't really checked either, because I don't really think about Age of Empires 3 all that much. But anyway, the point is that Age of Empires 2 HD brought with it a bunch of features that were very nice to see, and it also got content updates in the form of new expansion packs, which brought with them things like new campaigns, new civilizations, and such like that. So it was basically a revitalization of the series, or at least Age of Empires 2, which is the most popular game in the series, for very good reason. And then it took a while, but eventually we got the announcement of Age of Empires Definitive Edition, which was a complete ground-up remaster of the original Age of Empires along with the Rise of Rome expansion, with a reorchestrated soundtrack, completely redone visuals, a few extra convenience features that were introduced in later entries in the series, as well as redone multiplayer infrastructure that used Xbox Live. And of course, that was great to see. The original Age of Empires has aged very poorly and definitely needed some of those convenience features. And of course, it also is much more of a pain to get running properly on modern systems than even Age of Empires 2 is. So having the game touched up for modern systems and brought back to the market was definitely a good thing, and it left a lot of us wondering, well, what are they going to do from the series going forward? And then they ended up announcing Age of Empires 4, as well as Age of Empires 2 and 3 Definitive Editions. Now, the Definitive Editions of Age of Empires 2 and 3 came out before Age of Empires 4 did. And Definitive Edition of Age of Empires 2 is basically the same kind of treatment that Age of Empires 1 got in that regard, except this time it also included everything that had been introduced to Age of Empires 2 HD up to that point, which was very good to see. It effectively replaced Age of Empires 2 HD. Some people weren't particularly happy about that, other people were. Regardless, Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition is pretty fantastic for what it is. As for AoE 3 Definitive Edition, most people didn't really think that was necessary, myself included, because all that really needed to be done for Age of Empires 3 was to replace the online infrastructure that was with Ensemble Online with something that actually worked a lot better, like, say, Steam or Xbox Live or something like that. Instead, we got a basically re-release that included a few slight touch-ups here and there. Of course, online infrastructure was replaced, and some changes were made to the campaigns as well as the general gameplay that some people were really not very happy about because it was basically censoring the game. That said, it is still Age of Empires 3, so if you enjoyed that game, you'll probably still enjoy the Definitive Edition anyway, even if you don't like the changes that were made to it. And it is also worth noting that Microsoft and the teams that were working on the Definitive Editions have also been introducing new content to both of those as well. They haven't done anything with the original Age of Empires Definitive Edition, which is a bit of a shame, but Age of Empires 2 Definitive and AoE 3 Definitive have gotten new expansions that introduce new civilizations, new campaigns, stuff like that. Pretty substantial content updates, which is not really expected for games that are as old as those are, but is still definitely appreciated, especially considering that the quality of that content is generally quite good. But DW, you've probably been saying, this is a video that's supposed to be about Age of Empires 4, and you've spent this entire time talking about all of the previous games, well, except for Age of Mythology, because that's a spin-off, but whatever. Point is that you've been rambling about the previous games in the series. When are you going to talk about Age of Empires 4 itself? Well, here's the thing. You have to understand at least a basic overview of what came before Age of Empires 4 to understand why Age of Empires 4 itself is so depressing. You see, Age of Empires 1, 2, and 3 all clearly had a lot of passion behind them. They had people who were working on them who knew what they were doing with those games. They had a clear vision for them, and they executed that vision. And executed that vision so well that Age of Empires became a titan of the RTS genre, and Age of Empires 2 in particular has been continuously played by quite a lot of people since 1999, so we are dealing with a series that has had enduring popularity for, at the very least, 23 years. And then we get to Age of Empires 4. which was announced to be developed by Relic Entertainment. This was the first red flag, because Relic Entertainment at that point had been on a bit of a down streak. The last two games they had released were Company of Heroes 2 and Warhammer 40,000 Dawn of War 3. Now, admittedly, I only played Company of Heroes 2 a long time ago, and it ran like absolute garbage at the time, so I don't have a whole lot of personal experience with Company of Heroes 2 since it's been patched up the wazoo and had more content introduced and such. But it's a fairly divisive game. Some people really liked the changes that were made to the Company of Heroes formula, other people really hated them. So that made confidence in Relic's ability to keep developing real-time strategy games a bit shakier. And then Dawn of War 3 happened, and pretty much everybody at that point was like, what have you done with Relic Entertainment? Because Dawn of War 3 was a mess. So when Relic Entertainment was announced to be the developer of Age of Empires 4, that was a very mixed bag. On the one hand, theoretically, they are industry veterans who've been developing strategy games for over 20 years at this point. They should know what they're doing. I mean, remember, these are the developers that brought us not only the Dawn of War series and the Company of Heroes series, but also Homeworld, which is generally considered one of the best real-time strategy games ever made. Again, they should know what they're doing, so in theory, that's a good thing. But Company of Heroes 2 is rather divisive, and Dawn of War 3 is, well, frankly, an absolute mess that just ended up being a complete flop. So while they're certainly industry veterans who theoretically know what they're doing, they're definitely not infallible, and more importantly, their recent track record had not really been encouraging. So the announcement of Age of Empires 4 being developed by them was cause for concern. And that concern only deepened when the game was announced in 2017, and we didn't hear anything else about it until 2019. And it was at that point we found out that the original series plan, where Age of Empires 1 was Ancient Era, 2 was Medieval, 3 was the Colonial Era, 4 was supposed to be Modern Era, so World War I, World War II, etc., and then 5 was supposed to be in space, was not being followed. Instead, Age of Empires 4 was going to be another medieval game, which was not necessarily a red flag, but at least a yellow flag, because that was a very odd decision. Because that meant that no matter what they did for Age of Empires 4, it has to be directly compared with its medieval predecessor, Age of Empires 2. And really, no matter what Relic did with Age of Empires 4, it wasn't going to win that contest. I mean, by the time Age of Empires 4 would eventually release, Age of Empires 2 had basically 22 years of refinement. And keep in mind, the original Age of Empires 2 is still one of the best real-time strategy games ever made. It's only gotten better with all the extra content and all the refinements. So opening up your game to comparison with Age of Empires 2 is pretty much a colossally stupid idea, and yet that's exactly what Relic and Microsoft did with Age of Empires 4. And matters were not helped when they put out the technical tests, and people actually got a chance to try the game out and see what worked and what didn't work and give the developers some feedback. Because there were quite a few issues being noted during those technical tests that weren't just things like the servers aren't entirely stable, there's a bunch of lag that needs to be sorted out, there's performance issues, things like that. They were things like basic features that have been a staple of the series, even going back to the original game in 1997, just being blatantly absent. I mean, we're talking really basic things here, like not being able to rebind hotkeys, not being able to pick your player faction color, which has, again, been in the series since 1997, not being able to pick random civilizations, things like that, that are really basic, simple things that have been in the series since the original game, and yet were conspicuously absent in 4, at least during the technical tests. Understandably, people were a bit concerned about that, but hey, they were technical tests, maybe they were old versions, maybe they'd be in the game in the final release. So fast forward to October 28th, 2021, when the game officially released. And it was completely lacking all of those basic features that were identified as being missing during the technical tests. And in fact, a lot of the issues that were present during the technical tests were not fixed. For a lot of people, the game ran like absolute garbage because, as it turns out, it's almost entirely single-threaded, which is absolutely insane in 2021. Processors have not been built for that for quite a long time, so while the game actually ran pretty decently for me, because I currently am running an i7-4790K, which is a bit of an older processor that does a lot better at single-threading than a lot of the more recent ones. For people, say, running a Ryzen processor, which is mainly built for multi-threading, it ran like absolute garbage, and it didn't matter what your video card was either, because the game really isn't all that strenuous on a graphics card. It's only strenuous on the processor. So right at the outset, you have a large portion of the player base that really can't play the game at an acceptable frame rate, and that's immensely frustrating. And of course, since I'm still running the same rig and it runs basically the same as it did on launch, I have no idea if they actually fixed that or not. And on top of the performance issues, the game also had some online stability problems that do seem to have been fixed, so there is that at least. And it was still lacking a lot of those basic features that were identified as being missing when the game was in its technical tests. So on launch, you still could not pick your player faction color, so if you were playing it in single player, you were always blue no matter what, and as something I mentioned in my first impressions video, I'm fine with the color blue in and of itself, but I really hate playing as blue in real-time strategy games. I mean, I'll put up with it if you're only forced to play as blue during the campaigns, or if it's only on the minimap or something like that, but in any case where I am forced to play as blue in a real-time strategy game, I'm always going to be at least somewhat annoyed by it. But of course, that on its own is not necessarily going to be a deal breaker, so what about these other missing features? Well, it's things as simple as not being able to rebind your hotkeys, or not being able to select a random civilization, or having extremely bare-bones settings for the skirmish mode and, by extension, the multiplayer mode, such that it's missing entire modes of play that were in the original Age of Empires, and of course Age of Empires 2 and even Age of Empires 3. I mean, your only options for victory are destroying all enemy landmarks, controlling sacred sites, or building and holding a wonder. And while you can toggle which victory conditions you want out of those three, those are the only three. There's no alternate modes of play like, say, Regicide, or even something as simple as a deathmatch mode, where it's just a basic conquest mode, but you have a ton of resources at the start instead of just starting with the default resources. You can increase the amount of resources you start with, but it's still not a deathmatch mode. It's just the standard mode with more resources than you normally start with. In other words, it's basically the equivalent of playing a random map in Age of Empires 2 and selecting the higher resources option. And those kinds of things aren't the only basic features they removed. For whatever reason, they don't have waypoint indicators, so when you shift-click your scout around, for example, in previous Age of Empires games, it would put a flag down that showed where you clicked so you could remember where that waypoint is when you're shift-clicking somewhere else. In Age of Empires 4, there is the shift-click functionality that sets a waypoint, but it doesn't leave a marker where the waypoint is, so you just have to memorize it. There's no patrol option, which admittedly I didn't use much in the previous games, but it was still nice to be able to select a couple of waypoints and have your units patrol back and forth, so that if enemies happen to show up in that area, then they can go and engage them without just having a big clump of your units sitting around doing nothing. And of course there were no cheat codes, there were no taunts, hell, there wasn't even an in-game scoreboard at the game's launch. They had to patch that in later. And of course they didn't have any map editing tools or anything like that when the game launched, although that's not really all that surprising given that most games these days don't have that. Even as I'm recording this video, they only have that out in beta form, whatever that's supposed to mean, and it doesn't seem anywhere near as robust as what you see in even the original Age of Empires map editing tool. And even a lot of the stuff they had included in the game was just really lacking. I mean, the end of match statistics screen is basically worthless and gives you pretty much no useful information, especially compared to the statistics screens at the end of matches in previous Age of Empires games. I mean, hell, they couldn't even get the tutorial right. When you start the game up, it immediately throws you into the tutorial without letting you mess with any of your graphics settings or control options or anything like that. Just Start the game up, immediate tutorial, which is incredibly stupid to begin with. Developers should never, under any circumstances, on a PC game, throw you immediately into campaign, or multiplayer, or skirmish, or tutorial, or what the hell ever. They should always bring you to the main menu so you can adjust your graphics settings and adjust your control options. But even that annoyance aside, once you're in the tutorial, you find out you can't adjust your graphics settings until you've gone back to the main menu, because that makes sense in 2021. Why would you be expected to be able to change your graphics settings on the fly so you can see what they do to performance? I mean, that just doesn't make any sense at all, right? Anyway, back to the tutorial itself, they managed to screw that up by not giving you the basic controls to start with. They just start by saying, okay, here are some game concepts you need to know, and they expect you to just, I don't know, figure it out. You know what the really sad part is? I've been playing real-time strategy games for a long time, and Age of Empires in particular for about 25 years at this point. If they hadn't forced me into the tutorial upon launching the game for the first time, I wouldn't have bothered with the tutorial. I would have gone straight into the campaigns in the skirmish mode. But thanks to their absolutely baffling decision, here we are. Of course, once you get out of the tutorial and you are brought to the main menu, then you are given the option to either mess around with the campaigns, or the skirmish mode, or go online, or take part in the Art of War challenges. But regardless of which mode you went into on launch day, the game had numerous problems. I already mentioned the performance issues, but there were also issues with things like unit pathfinding, where they would frequently get stuck on things, especially on gates and stone walls and palisade walls for some utterly baffling reason. And there were other weird issues like the unit hitboxes being kind of wonky. You would go to click on a unit and it wouldn't actually select them. And this is all, of course, on top of the balancing issues the game launched with, where some of the factions were barely playable at best because of these weird balancing problems. So, regardless of anything else, the game had issues that needed to be patched out, and over time, they did patch most of those issues out. There are still some pathfinding issues and some really odd glitches here and there. I mean, I've got a clip to show you of a bunch of scouts that all went into a circle and just got stuck there for some reason. And the thing is, I don't really mind the balancing issues or the odd technical issues all that much. I know those can be patched out pretty effectively. The problem is that the issues go beyond simple technical problems like that. As I've mentioned before, there were a bunch of missing features on launch. They've added some of those back in with their Season 1 and Season 2 updates, but to give you an example of just how glacial the pace has been with that, they only added in the player faction color picker as of the Season 2 update earlier this month, July of 2022. And that means that it took them about 9 months to put in a very basic, very simple feature that has been in the Age of Empires series since the very first game back in 1997. Hell, it's been in most real-time strategy games since the 90s, so we've been at the point where a basic feature that's been in the entire genre for almost 30 years was not only not implemented in Age of Empires 4, but they acted like it was either some sort of revelation that people actually cared about it, or they were just being outright condescending about it. I mean, listen to the way they describe this in their Age of Empires 4 in 2022 blog post thing that was announcing all of the roadmap features. Player Color Picker. We've seen this feature request pop up across a number of venues, from chats during our developer streams to our official forums and more. While we designed the current system to provide consistent colors based on the individual team or opponent, we recognize that Player Color Picker allows for important customization. And keep in mind, the game launched with team colors enabled by default. That means that the player is blue, all of their allies are yellow, and the enemy is red. Period. End of story. You had to enable unique colors to be able to see not only red, blue, and yellow, but also green, teal, purple, pink, and orange. In previous Age of Empires games, team colors was an option you had to go and specifically enable. So basically what the developers of Age of Empires 4 were saying is, we know better than you, but because you won't stop complaining about this, I guess we have to implement it. And if they weren't being somewhat condescending about it, they were acting like it was some kind of gargantuan task to implement certain features. I mean, hotkey improvements on that same post. Fully remappable inputs require substantial development time across the board, and while we're not there just yet, we expect to introduce fully remappable inputs in Season 2. In other words, they're saying it is some sort of gargantuan task to implement the ability to change your hotkeys. And they did in fact introduce that with the Season 2 update, earlier this month, July 2022, 9 months after the game launched. And even 9 months after the game launched, there's still a ton of missing simple features that are just baffling by their absence. There's still woefully underdeveloped systems and underdeveloped mechanics. I mean, the Season 2 update also unlocked the campaigns so you can actually play the campaign missions in whatever order you want instead of having to go through the English campaign first and then go through the other stuff. Meanwhile, in the previous Age of Empires games, you could select whichever campaign you wanted to go through right at the beginning. It just makes you wonder what the hell Relic were doing with the game over the past 4 years. I mean, they're still adding in simple, very basic features this long after launch, when they really should be focusing more on content updates and putting in new civilizations and new features that weren't in previous games and so on and so forth. Instead, they're just throwing a balance patch here, throwing in a slight patch there for some weird glitch or something like that, and then as of Season 2, it's like, here, have a bunch of simple basic features that should have been in the game on launch day. But no, here we are 9 months after launch, and we have absolutely no news on any upcoming civilizations or any new major content expansions or anything like that. And if anything, the developers are barely communicating anything to the fan base. They're just basically saying, okay, well, here's all of these tournament events that we're working on, and people aren't really concerned with that anywhere near as much as they're concerned with things like, hey, are you going to fix these glitches? Hey, are you going to put in these basic features that we've been asking for since the technical tests? Or, hey, what about new content that would maybe help revitalize the game a bit? Any of that kind of stuff? Nope, just can't be bothered? Okay then. And that's all frustrating enough, but when you combine that with the game's confused sense of identity, that makes it so much worse. I mean, I already mentioned the whole tournaments thing, and how the developers and publishers have been basically trying to push those more than they've been actually pushing updates and content and such like that. And when you actually go into the game and start to examine it more closely, you realize pretty quickly that this is basically the exact opposite in what they were trying to go for compared to Age of Empires 1, 2, and 3. In other words, they've fallen into the exact same pit that has ruined so many real-time strategy games in the aftermath of StarCraft. They're trying to focus on esports, a minuscule minority of the player base. And it's not just from them constantly trying to push the tournaments and stuff, it's just from the general game design. I mean, you might go into the Art of War challenges thinking that they're just going to be some fun challenge scenarios that give you some odd situations that you need to find your way out of, but if you have any knowledge whatsoever of how Age of Empires competitive play works, you immediately recognize them as tutorials for the multiplayer, except that they're done in a fairly condescending way. The idea is basically that if you can't get the gold medals on all of the Art of War challenges, you're not good enough to play the game online. So let's say you take that at face value and go, okay, well, if I'm not good enough to play it online, I'll just play the single player. Well, in that case, you have two options. You either have the campaigns or the skirmish mode. And thankfully now the campaigns are unlocked by default, but when the game originally released, you had to play through the English campaign first. And the English campaign is arguably the most boring campaign in the entire game, which is impressive, because every campaign in this game is really boring. There's barely any variation to any of the campaign missions, and to make matters worse, they do everything in this sort of documentary style, which you might think sounds interesting at first, but once you're actually in the game and seeing what the documentary stuff entails, it's a bunch of modern-day drone footage and such that they put some overlays over and they just talk over, and then when you're actually in the game proper, it's still the same narrator from the documentary stuff, just narrating what's happening in an extremely dull manner. And if it were just the really dull documentary footage and the dull narration during the missions, that would be bad enough. But it's so much worse than that because the campaigns are extremely restrictive in what you can actually do. Presumably to make it more historically accurate, but then if all you're doing is making the player do a prescribed set of things, what's even the point of making it a real-time strategy game, or a strategy game in general? The point of a strategy game is to think through the scenario and see what you need to do, and figure out a way to get to it. But the way Age of Empires 4's campaigns work is that you don't have to think about anything. The game just outright tells you exactly what to do, and you just do it. There's no reason to do anything else because the game won't let you do anything else. And considering the multiplayer stuff is oriented almost entirely towards the competitive scene, which is again a minuscule minority of the player base, and the single player campaigns are restrictive and overly dull, what's left for a player to latch onto? Well, I guess you could play the skirmish mode, and even if you jump into the least restricted mode in the game, the skirmish mode, you find out that even the skirmish mode is just dull, because again, not only do you not have any of the cheat codes or any of the fun taunts or anything like that, but instead of the historical figures that you would be going up against in previous Age of Empires games, which were randomly chosen based on the faction that they were representing, in Age of Empires 4 it's AI, easy, AI, intermediate, AI, hard, AI, hardest. And not only that, but there's no diplomacy and they will not communicate with you at all, so if you try to coordinate anything with AI teammates, good luck with that, you're gonna need it. I mean, it's not like the AI was much better about that in the previous Age of Empires games, but at least if you said, attack an enemy now, they would respond with yes or no, and then they would either send a force to go and attack them, even if it was just a token force, or if they refused, they would hold their forces back. Or you could ask them for resources, and then they could send you resources. Can't do that in Age of Empires 4. And then, of course, there's the unit counter system that they implemented in Age of Empires 4. Now, Age of Empires has always had a sort of counter system built into it, but it's always been much softer counters than what you see in AoE 4. In previous Age of Empires games, you would have things like, say, spearmen being really good against cavalry, and not so great against everything else, but if you deploy them in enough numbers, then they can be really effective. Meanwhile, you go over to Age of Empires 4, and it really doesn't matter how many spearmen you deploy, because the only thing they have a chance in hell of beating is cavalry. If you deploy them against anything else, even villagers, they just get stomped on. And look, I get that hard counters are much better for competitive play, but again, the competitive scene is such a minuscule portion of the player base that it really doesn't matter. So by trying to push the competitive side of things and trying to cater almost exclusively to their needs, they're basically alienating the vast majority of the Age of Empires fan base, so frankly it's not surprising that the player counts have dropped dramatically. I mean, we don't really have player numbers for the version on the Microsoft Store and Xbox Game Pass and all of that, but at least as far as Steam goes, Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition has almost 3 times the number of players that Age of Empires 4 does on a regular basis. And it's really not hard to see why. I mean, Age of Empires 2 is not only a finished game, but it's extremely refined. It has a ton of content, it has a very robust single-player experience, and good multiplayer. Whereas Age of Empires 4 is extremely dull in the single-player department, and it focuses almost exclusively on competitive multiplayer that barely anybody cares about. It's certainly not the worst RTS I've ever played, and honestly I wouldn't even really describe it as a bad game outright, but it is certainly a bad Age of Empires game. For this series, we really expect a hell of a lot better, and we also expect a hell of a lot better from Relic Entertainment. They definitely should know better, but instead, it seems like they have completely lost touch with reality. They've at least lost touch with their own fan base, because Company Heroes 2 was kind of a mess, and Dawn of War 3 was definitely a mess. But since it's also painfully obvious they have no idea what Age of Empires fans want, and frankly it's obvious they don't care what Age of Empires fans want, I have absolutely no confidence they're going to be able to turn this game around, and frankly I wouldn't be remotely surprised if they abandoned development of it very soon. I mean, after all, they already did that with Dawn of War 3, so I can't really have much confidence in Age of Empires 4 at this point. And frankly, I can't have confidence in anything Relic is developing at this point. I mean, Company of Heroes 3 is supposed to come out later this year, and I have absolutely no confidence whatsoever in Relic's ability to pull it off. And that's what's ultimately just so depressing about this whole mess. It just seems like Relic Entertainment is the real problem here, and that Age of Empires 4 is just an unfortunate casualty. Given how many basic, simple things were either missing or really poorly implemented on launch, it makes you wonder where all of that talent that made games like Homeworld and Company of Heroes and Dawn of War and Dawn of War 2 went. And it seems like not only are they just completely out of touch with what their fans want, they don't actually seem to care what their fans want. They think they know better than their fans, and whenever their fans start saying, hey, we actually really want this other thing, they seem to either not listen at all, or if they do listen, they might respond in a fairly condescending manner, like, well, we designed it this way because we think this is better, but I guess since you won't stop complaining, here's the feature you've been clamoring for. It's almost like they've taken a deliberately antagonistic stance towards their fans, because their fans want good single-player experiences that happen to have a solid multiplayer base so they can go and have some casual fun. And instead, Relic has just decided to go off the deep end and try to capture the competitive scene, which is such a tiny minority, it basically guarantees that their games are going to fail from here on out. Who knows? Maybe they'll see the light at some point, but I very highly doubt that, and I very highly doubt that Age of Empires 4 is ever going to recover from this. I highly doubt that it's ever going to actually be properly feature complete compared to its predecessors, and at this point, honestly, I fully expect that they're just going to abandon development of the game pretty soon, because it's already floundering and I really don't see them ever recovering from this, even if they do put out major content expansions and such. Because at the end of the day, Age of Empires 4 may be mechanically competent, but it has absolutely no soul, and that's really not something you can just fix with a patch. Thanks for watching, and thanks for bearing with me over the past week while I was recovering from illness. I'm really starting to think at this point that the Elden Ring video I've been trying to do over the past several months is just absolutely cursed, because every single time it seems like I'm making progress, something comes along that stops that progress in its tracks, and it gets incredibly frustrating. And as you can see from this video, I ended up taking a bit of a detour into Age of Empires 4 thanks to that Season 2 update dropping, and given how wimpy that update is and how wimpy all of the previous updates are, I just got tired of waiting for them to finish the game and decided, you know what, I'm just going to do a video on it and get it over with and get this off of my system so I can just move on to other things and try to forget that Age of Empires 4 exists. Because when I say this game depresses me to no end, I really do mean it. Age of Empires 2 is my favorite real-time strategy game of all time. And while I'm really not all that big on the era of history that Age of Empires 3 goes over, and the game itself had a bunch of issues, it was still really enjoyable as well. So seeing something like Age of Empires 4 come around and not only tread basically the same exact ground that Age of Empires 2 did, but not anywhere near as good or as comprehensive, and also be a soulless husk of a game that's trying to cater to the competitive crowd that basically doesn't exist, well, it's basically confirming what I already feared about Relic after having played Company of Heroes 2 and Dawn of War 3, and it's basically the nail in the coffin for Age of Empires as a series in general. For over a decade, I have been lamenting the loss of the Age of Empires series and Ensemble Studios, and then it finally comes back, and this crap is what we get. It's just sad. Anyway, I've rambled long enough. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.